Hello students, welcome to my lecture. Today we are going to discuss the changing dimensions of security in the post-Cold War era. We are going to divide this lecture into two parts. Today I am going to talk about the first part, which deals with various types of security which have emerged in the post-Cold War era. These types of threats to security, in fact, had not been witnessed during the Cold War period. Actually, one can argue that there has taken place a qualitative shift in perceptions about threats to security in the post-Cold War era. In fact, these can be categorized into two types. Firstly, external and internal, as well as military and non-military. Now, let me explain what I mean by them. Now, the traditional concerns about security have been primarily to do with external dimensions. And when we talk about external dimensions, what we mean is essentially threats associated with military aspects. That means states have always endeavored or tried to protect themselves from dangers of aggression, of territorial occupation, and military intervention from outside, through acquisition of weapons or association with military alliances. Let me explain further what I mean by that. Generally, we have seen in history that states have tried to protect themselves or secure themselves against any kind of external threats, which essentially means aggression from outside powers. And in order to deal with such threats, they have tried to arm themselves, equip themselves with weapons, so that they can protect themselves against this kind of external aggressions. History is full of this kind of examples. Now, during the Cold War period, that is the period between 1945 and 1990, many armed conflicts have taken place. Now, we do not have the time to go into the details of these armed conflicts, but I will refer to some of them. For instance, the Korean conflict, when North Korea invaded South Korea in June 1950, and as a result of which the Korean War started. And in fact, it became an international conflict. Then the war in Vietnam. This was a very long-drawn war, which involved actually firstly the liberation of Indochina from French colonial rule, and thereafter, of course, communist forces, they tried to take over the whole of Indochina. And the United States intervened, and that resulted in a long conflict, ultimately ending in 1975 with the final victory of the communist forces. Then the Arab-Israeli conflict. This again is a very long-drawn conflict. It still has not been resolved. It still continues. It all started in 1948 when the State of Israel was established, and the Arabs actually did not accept the establishment of the State of Israel, and this resulted in this long-drawn conflict. As I just mentioned, there has been no solution to this conflict as yet. Then in 1962, there was a war between China and India, which is fairly well known. And this relates to the issue of border, the unsettled border between India and China. And China invaded India in October 1962, and that resulted in a 1-month war, which actually was very bad for India. Then, of course, there has been India-Pakistan wars. There have taken place 4 India-Pakistan wars. So, what I'm trying to say that, there have been traditionally these kind of military conflicts, and states have primarily tried to guard themselves, safeguard themselves against this kind of conflicts, this kind of wars, and so on and so forth. But when the Cold War ended, actually, we find, in the last 25 years, from 1991 to, say, today, 2016, a qualitative shift has taken place, since 1991. Although some traditional conflicts have still taken place. I'm not arguing here that traditional conflicts that I have just described to you, which took place during the Cold War year, as well as in the preceding period in human history, I'm not suggesting that these types of conflicts have totally ended. I can give you a few examples. For instance, Kuwait in 1991, when Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait and occupied Kuwait. Then the Kargil conflict between India and Pakistan in 1998. That was also a traditional conflict. And then you have Eritrea, the conflict between Eritrea and Ethiopia. In fact, what we witnessed during the Cold War period as well as pre-Cold War period were interstate conflicts. That is, conflict between states. But today, we find actually a new phenomenon, that is conflict within states, that is intra-state conflicts. Now, these are essentially civil wars, or as I said, intra-state conflicts, then between states. For instance, 90% of the conflicts during the post-Cold War period have been civil wars. And here, actually, we have a long list of civil wars, starting with Afghanistan, Angola, Central African Republic, former Yugoslavia, Georgia, Haiti, Liberia, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Somalia, Tajikistan, Sudan, Syria, Libya, etc. So as you heard just now, actually the list is a long one, and essentially these conflicts are, you must have also noted, confined primarily to the developing countries. That is, emerging countries, countries actually which were liberated from colonial control, colonial domination only in the aftermath of the Second World War. These conflicts have taken place due to various reasons, which obviously I do not have the time to go into, but I'm sure you are familiar with some of these conflicts which are continuing even today. For instance, say Afghanistan or Somalia, Sudan, in fact Libya. Some of these conflicts are still continuing. And these conflicts have witnessed a very high degree of brutalities. Where small arms, which are now very readily available, and I'm referring to, for instance, arms such as hand grenades, AK-47, landmines, these have been very readily used, and their purpose, of course, was to inflict the maximum possible casualties, deaths, injuries, and even disabilities caused to the victims. In fact, these wars have caused severe misery to millions of unconnected and innocent men, women, and children. And that actually has lent a very poignant dimension to these conflicts. Previously, I think, just take a note of the changing nature of these conflicts. Not only they have changed from interstate to intrastate, but also the victims are primarily civilians. Previously, in the previous conflicts, the victims were essentially combatants, soldiers. But today, as I just mentioned, that innocent men, women and children, they are in fact increasingly subjected to this kind of brutalities and ultimately deaths. And the number of deaths that have taken place actually in these conflicts during the last 25 years, I do not have the exact figure, but it will run into millions, to say the least. In fact, a new term has been coined during this period called ethnic cleansing. Now, ethnic cleansing, this is a term actually that was not known earlier. It basically means then that one ethnic group tries to eliminate completely what it considers to be its enemy ethnic group. We found a clear example of this or demonstration of this in Yugoslavia during the period 1991 to 1995, when the Yugoslav Federation disintegrated because of this civil war, this ethnic civil war. And here what happened was that the Serbs, who had primarily been the dominant ethnic group in the Yugoslav Federation, they tried to eliminate the other ethnic groups that comprised the Yugoslav Federation, namely the Bosnians, the Croatians, the Slovenians, the Kosovans, the Macedonians. But the most devastating demonstration of this ethnic cleansing actually was witnessed in Bosnia, which was the most ethnically diverse province of Yugoslavia, where the Muslims comprised about 44% of the population, the Serbs about 32%, and the Croats another 25%. And it turned into a most savage kind of conflict, where millions of people, hundreds of thousands of people actually were killed, and in the most brutal fashion. And there actually what I am referring to is something like killing of women, gang rape of women, and also another phenomenon that we witness not in Yugoslavia but in Africa primarily, that is the usage of children as soldiers, child soldiers. In fact, this has been another most sad and depressing dimension of this change in security, in the dimension of security that I'm talking about. In fact, 95% of the loss of life I was referring to earlier were innocent people, innocent men, women and children. In fact, if we look at the Syrian conflict of today, which is also an internal war, an internal civil war, something like 270,000 people have lost their lives in a period of 4 years, that is between 2011 and 2015. So what we find today actually is a transformation where state-centric security actually has been replaced by human security. That is, in other words, this is something that I'm going to explain in greater details later on. That is, states are no longer able to provide the kind of security that they provided earlier in earlier periods. Now, of course, the question may arise that why is it that this kind of ethnic conflicts are being noticed or being witnessed primarily during the post-Cold War era. Why did they not happen in the previous period, that is during the Cold War period? You see, the primary reason for that there has taken place a breakdown of structures that previously contributed to keeping such conflicts under some kind of control. What I am referring to actually, that during the Cold War period, the world was bipolar. And I hope you know the meaning of bipolar, that one pole was dominated by the United States and the other pole was dominated by the Soviet Union. And there was this overarching bipolar system which managed to camouflage, which managed to actually disguise, these kinds of ethnic outbreaks during this period. That is, in other words, what we are witnessing today actually is an assertion, a forceful assertion of ethnic identities, particularly in multi-ethnic societies and in multi-ethnic countries. Where there are different ethnic groups who actually live together. I already gave you examples of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, as also Czechoslovakia earlier. And we have such examples, many such examples in other parts of the world, particularly in Africa as well as in Asia. And these ethnic groups, they are now actually trying to assert their control. So these ethnic conflicts are now coming into the open because people are now coming into greater contact with each other. That did not happen earlier. And they are also competing for scarce items like jobs, land, respect, or recognition. And in many respects, actually, it is becoming very difficult to solve these ethnic conflicts because they have become intractable. And intractable means, that they are difficult to resolve, they are difficult to reconcile. For instance, we can refer to Afghanistan. Afghanistan is still, the conflict is still continuing, and there are multiple other examples where such intractability actually is continuing. Apart from that, there are other factors like leadership ambitions. That is, leader of a particular ethnic group actually is ambitious and he wants to assert himself and his control. Then there is also the historical animosity. For instance, again, let me go back to Yugoslavia, the historical animosity between the Serbs and the Croats. In Yugoslavia, in what used to be Yugoslavia. This historical animosity actually dates back, well back into the centuries, into history. They have been actually at each other's throats for a very long time. Apart from that, actually, what is becoming increasingly clear that certain multi-ethnic countries actually are unviable, that they are not able to live together. So therefore, they have to separate. Apart from Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, I also gave the example of Czechoslovakia. There are two ethnic groups in Czechoslovakia, in what used to be former Czechoslovakia, the Czechs and the Slovaks. Now, they actually were living together for quite some time during most of the Cold War period. But after the end of the Cold War, actually they decided that they could not live together. They were two very distinct ethnic groups with very distinct identities, and so therefore they wanted to separate and have their own separate republics, and that is precisely what happened. But fortunately, actually in the case of Czechoslovakia, it all happened without any bloodshed or without any conflict. Apart from what we discussed so far, that is ethnic separatism and conflict, another type of conflict and threats to security have emerged during the post-Cold War era, and this is basically religious and racial intolerance. In fact, this is something that is nothing new. This kind of intolerance has prevailed throughout in human history. In fact, here there is a general tendency to blame Islam, that Islamic fundamentalism has risen as one of the primary factors, as one of the primary threats to security. But such fundamentalism is not confined only to Islam. There are other religious groups which are also, where fundamentalism is also raising its head. So, in other words, the emergence of religious fundamentalism actually is another very specific dimension of the post-Cold War era. And in fact, what happens is that this kind of fundamentalism, they are patronized across boundaries for supply of military hardware and funds. In fact, these fundamentalist groups actually, they carry out all kinds of terrorist activities, all kinds of insurgencies, and for that they manage to secure funds from various parts of the world, primarily from people who are sympathetic to their cause. And here we are talking about actually, also mafia groups are linked with drug trafficking, with arms dealing, and money laundering. So this has become a very serious problem so far as the post-Cold War period is concerned. So this issue of religious intolerance, is a big challenge during this period that we are talking about. And with the passage of time, we find that this kind of intolerance is increasing in various parts of the world. Our own country is also not free from it. For that matter, we find it in the West also. Particularly in America, in the present presidential election campaign, we find that there is also emerging some kind of an intolerance against Muslims and other racial groups. So this is a very big challenge and a fundamental challenge that the post-Cold War era has to contend with.